At 9:48 on a Saturday night, in a ballroom lit gold and filled with the wealthiest people in the city, a woman in a couture gown drew back her hand and slapped a frail older woman hard across the face. The sound of it cut through the music. 300 guests turned, saw what had happened, and then, one by one, decided it was easier to look away. The woman who threw that slap was Camille Beaumont, chief executive of one of the most admired car companies in Detroit, and she believed, with the smooth certainty of a person who had never once been wrong in public, that she was protecting something precious. What she did not know was that the plainly dressed woman she had just struck was the mother of the man who, before that night was finished, would own the company Camille ran, the building they were standing in, and the very chair she had spent 20 years climbing toward. By sunrise, Camille Beaumont would lose almost all of it. So why did a quiet single father in a borrowed jacket stand at the edge of that room and let her keep talking? And what was the small engraved medallion that had set every piece of this in motion? The road to that ballroom had begun 9 days earlier, in a cold repair shop on the east side of Detroit. Elijah Carter opened his shop at 7:15 every morning, the way he had for 11 years, and the first thing he did was turn on the work lights over the lift and let the old building wake up around him. He was a tall, unhurried man in his late 30s, with careful hands and the kind of stillness that made people lower their voices without quite knowing why. He wore a faded canvas jacket, jeans gone pale at the knees, and boots that had been resoled twice. On his right wrist, looped twice so it would not slip off, was a small pink elastic hair tie that did not belong to him, and he never took it off. He restored old cars, not the flashy work that got photographed, but the slow, honest kind, the kind where a man spends 3 weeks getting a single body panel to sit exactly right. He was, though he would never have said it, one of the best in the state at what he did. People who understood engines drove a long way to leave their cars in his hands. 11 years ago, he had run this shop with his wife, Naomi, who kept the books and laughed at his terrible jokes and told him he worked too hard. Naomi had died 4 years back, after an illness that took everything slowly and then all at once. Elijah did not talk about it. He kept a photograph in a drawer and a habit of finishing his sentences in his head, as if she might still answer. These days, he closed earlier than he used to. Every afternoon, at a few minutes before 3, he wiped his hands, locked the lift, and left, because there was someone who counted on the sound of his truck in the driveway at the same hour every single day. In the back seat of that truck were a booster cushion and a small umbrella shaped like a ladybug. On the dashboard, he kept a drawing, folded into careful quarters, all stick figures, and a fat yellow sun. And when a day went hard, he would press it flat against his shirt pocket for a moment before he started the engine. There was one more thing Elijah carried, and it was older than all of it. On a worn leather cord around his neck hung a small brass medallion, no bigger than a silver dollar, stamped with a crest he had never been able to place, 2 crossed keys above a single star, and on the back, almost worn smooth, 3 letters and a year. His mother had given it to him on the day he turned 18. She said it had come from his father. She had also said, gently and without bitterness, that she had never known the man's full name. That medallion had hung against Elijah's chest for 20 years without meaning a thing to anyone. In 9 days, a woman in a gold ballroom would glance at it for half a second, and that half a second would end her. The job came in on a Monday, and it was the kind of job that did not usually find a shop like his. A long black car pulled up outside, and a young man in a suit came in holding a folder and asked if Elijah Carter was the owner. Inside the folder were photographs of a car Elijah had only ever seen in magazines. A 1969 Vance Coronado, one of fewer than 90 ever built, a long, low, beautiful machine made by Vance Continental Holdings back when the Vance name still meant something built by hand. Crestline Automotive Group, a company owned by Vance Continental, was hosting a gala in 9 days to celebrate 60 years of the brand. And the centerpiece was to be this exact car, restored to perfection, and driven onto a small stage in front of 300 guests and a room full of press. The previous shop had failed. The car needed to run and run flawlessly, and it needed to be ready in 9 days. Elijah looked at the photographs for a long time. He asked only one question. He asked who had signed off on the timeline. The young man said the chief executive wanted to oversee it personally. Her name was Camille Beaumont. She arrived the next morning in a car worth more than his entire shop, and she walked across his floor, dark with the oil of 1,000 jobs, in shoes that had never touched a floor like it. Camille Beaumont was striking, precise, and warm in the practiced way of a person who has learned that warmth opens doors. She shook his hand and told him she had heard he was the best, and she said it as though she were handing him a gift. Then her eyes dropped for just a moment to the brass medallion resting against his collarbone. Something in her face changed. It changed so quickly that a less watchful man would have missed it. Elijah did not miss it. He had spent a lifetime watching faces. But he said nothing, and she recovered, and the moment passed. What Elijah could not have known was this. 3 weeks earlier, a paid contact inside the offices that managed the Vance family fortune had told Camille Beaumont something no one outside those rooms was supposed to know. The old founder, Solomon Vance, had died 18 months before without a single recognized heir, and a quiet search had finally turned up a name. A man on the east side of Detroit, a car mechanic, a widower with no idea who he was. The crossed keys above a star was the Vance family crest, and Camille had seen it in oil paintings her whole career. She had not come to Elijah Carter for a car. She had come to look at him. The car was an excuse, and once she had seen the medallion against his chest, she knew the tip was true, and she began very carefully to make plan. Over the next several days, Camille came to the shop more often than any executive needed to. She brought coffee. She asked about his life with what seemed like real interest. She listened, and she was good at it. She learned that he was raising someone alone, that he had lost his wife, that he carried his grief quietly and his kindness openly, and she filed each fact away the way a careful buyer studies a property before making an offer. She was, in her own mind, not doing anything wrong. She was simply seeing an opportunity that any sensible person would take, and taking it. But there was one thing Camille wanted that Elijah would not give, and it had nothing to do with her plan and everything to do with who he was. The Coronado, when it finally arrived on a flatbed, was a wreck of a beautiful thing. Elijah spent 2 days just listening to it, turning the engine over by hand, reading the worn places, and he found the original build sheet tucked up under the back seat, where the factory workers had left it 60 years before. What he found there told him something important. The engine in this car was the engine the factory had put in it. The numbers stamped on the block matched the numbers on the build sheet and the title. In the world of collectible cars, that is everything. A car whose original engine still lives under its hood is called a matching numbers car, and it can be worth many times more than the same car with a replacement engine, because it is honest. It is the real thing all the way down. The problem was that the original engine needed a month of work, and they had 9 days. So Camille made a suggestion that sounded reasonable. Pull the old engine. Drop in a modern crate engine. Brand new, reliable, guaranteed to start on cue in front of the cameras. Store the original in a box. No one at the gala would know the difference. The car would run perfectly. The night would be flawless, and later quietly, the original could go back in. Reasonable, efficient, a small, invisible lie. Elijah set down his wrench and told her no. He explained it plainly, without heat. He said that the moment you pull a matching numbers engine and tell the room the car is original, you have lied to every person who came to see something real. He said the car had survived 60 years being exactly what it was, and he was not going to be the man who turned it into a fake for one good night. He said he would have the original engine running in 9 days, or he would tell her honestly that he could not. But he would never put a lie on that stage. Camille smiled and said she admired his principles, and inside she felt the first thread of something cold. She was not used to the word no, and the people who worked for her, who watched a mechanic in a worn jacket tell their chief executive how things would be, traded the kind of glance that people trade when they expect someone to be punished later. He had the original engine running in 8 days. He did it by working until his hands ached, by sleeping 4 hours a night, by treating metal that was 60 years old with more patience than most people give other human beings. On the 8th night, the Coronado started on the first turn of the key and settled into an idle like a sleeping animal, deep and even and true. And Elijah stood alone in his shop and listened to it and thought about how Naomi would have loved the sound. The gala was held at the Marquette Hotel on Woodward Avenue, in a ballroom dressed in gold light and white orchids, and Elijah Carter almost did not go. He was a mechanic. He had done his job. But Camille had insisted warmly that the man who saved the car deserved to see it on the stage, and so he put on the only suit jacket he owned, an old one that pulled across the shoulders, and he brought the one person in the world he wanted beside him on a night that felt, for the first time in years, like pride. He brought his mother. Pearl Carter was 64 years old, and she had raised her son alone in a small house with a leaking roof, working as a hospital cleaner by day and taking in laundry at night, and she had done it without ever once making her boy feel that he was a burden. She wore her good dress, the navy one, the only formal thing she owned, and she had pressed it 3 times that afternoon. She held her son's arm in the gold ballroom and looked at all the orchids and the chandeliers and said quietly that she had never seen anything so beautiful in all her life. People glanced at her plain dress and her worn hands, and then at each other, and Pearl pretended not to notice. The way she had pretended not to notice such things for most of her life. Then, near the start of the evening, a man Elijah had never met crossed the room and asked, very quietly, if he might have a word in private. The man was in his 60s, gray at the temples, with the upright bearing of someone who has spent 40 years being the most serious person in every room he enters. His name, he said, was Cornelius Greer, and he was senior counsel for the Vance Family Trust. He apologized for the timing. He said the matter could not wait, and he led Elijah out of the ballroom and into a quiet side room, leaving Pearl alone for a few minutes among the orchids. What Greer told him in that side room, Elijah would spend the rest of his life remembering. He learned that his father had a name, and that the name was Solomon Vance. He learned that the brass medallion he had worn for 20 years was a Vance family piece, given long ago by a young man to a young woman he loved and then lost. He learned that Solomon Vance had spent the final years of his life trying to find that woman, leaving instructions and resources to locate her, and that the search had found her, and through her had found her son, and that a test had confirmed what the old man had only ever dared to hope. Elijah Carter was Solomon Vance's son, the only one, and under the law and the founder's own wishes, everything the Vance name still held now belonged to him. Elijah sat very still. He thought about his mother, alone in the ballroom, in the navy dress she had pressed 3 times. He stood to go back to her. He was too late by 90 seconds. While Elijah was in the side room, Pearl Carter had drifted, the way a person does at a party where they know no one, toward the front of the ballroom, where the restored Coronado sat under a single warm light on a low stage. She did not know that her son had saved it. She only knew that it was beautiful. She stepped closer, drawn to the deep shine of it, and she lifted one hand, not to touch it, only to be near it, the way you lift a hand toward a fire. And Camille Beaumont, who had staked her entire future on this one flawless night, who was already on edge, who saw a shabby old woman reaching toward the irreplaceable centerpiece of her evening, crossed the floor in 6 fast steps and lost, for the first time in her careful life, all of her control. She did not ask who Pearl was. She told her she did not belong here. She said it loudly, so the nearest tables would hear, that the help should know better than to wander in and put their hands on things worth more than their whole lives. Pearl tried to say that she had only been looking, that her son was here, and Camille cut her off. And then, in front of 300 people, Camille Beaumont drew back her hand and slapped Pearl Carter across the face. The twin of that brass medallion, the same crest of crossed keys, hung at that very moment around the neck of the man walking back through the door. The ballroom went silent. It was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of complicity, of 300 comfortable people each deciding, in their own private way, that it was not worth the trouble to step forward. Pearl stood with her hand against her cheek, in her navy dress, her press dress, and she did not cry and she did not shout. She simply looked for her son. And her son had just walked into the room. Elijah Carter stopped in the doorway. He saw his mother with her hand against her face. He saw the woman who had spent 9 days bringing him coffee, and learning his griefs standing over her with her hand still raised. And something in him went very quiet, the deep quiet of a man who has just understood several enormous things at the same time, and is deciding, with great care, what to do with each of them. He did not shout. He crossed the room slowly, and the crowd, sensing something without knowing what, parted for him. He reached his mother and put his hand gently on her shoulder and asked her, softly, if she was all right. Pearl looked up at him and nodded, because she had spent her life sparing him her pain. He looked at her cheek, where the mark was already rising. He did not say anything for a moment. Then Cornelius Greer stepped into the room behind him, and others came with him, and the night turned over like a great wheel. Greer did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He spoke into the silence with 40 years of authority behind every word, and he said that there had been a terrible mistake, and that the room should understand exactly who it was looking at. He said that the man standing there in the jacket that did not fit was Elijah Carter, the only son and sole heir of Solomon Vance, and the new controlling owner of Vance Continental Holdings and every company beneath it, including Crestline Automotive Group. He let that settle. Then he said the second thing. He said that the woman who had just been struck was Elijah Carter's mother. And then he said the third thing, the thing that made Camille Beaumont reach out and steady herself against the back of a chair. He said that she was the woman Solomon Vance had loved as a young man and searched for until the day he died. The proof came quickly, because Greer was a careful man and had brought it. He held up a record from the founder's private papers, in Solomon Vance's own hand, describing the brass medallion he had given long ago to a young woman named Pearl, 2 crossed keys above a star, with her initials and the year on the back. Elijah lifted the medallion from his own neck and held it up in the gold light, and it matched exactly. An elderly woman beside Greer, named Ophelia Stokes, who had managed the Vance estate out in Grosse Pointe for 31 years, stepped forward with tears on her face and said that she had heard the old man speak the name Pearl 100 times in his last years, and that he had never once stopped looking. A member of the company board named Reginald Foster confirmed, in a shaking voice, that the trust had located and verified the heir weeks ago, and that the information had been kept strictly confidential. And it was that last word, confidential, that turned the whole room toward Camille Beaumont, because Reginald Foster also said, quietly, that there had been a leak, that someone had paid for information they were never meant to have, and every head in that gold ballroom turned slowly toward the chief executive of Crestline, who had appeared in a mechanic's shop 9 days earlier with a car as her excuse, and who now stood frozen, her hand still faintly red from the blow she had struck. Elijah finally spoke. His voice was low and even, and it carried to every corner of the room. He said, "The woman you just slapped is my mother." He let it sit. He said that she had raised him alone in a house with a leaking roof, that she had cleaned hospital floors so that he could eat, and that she was a better person on the worst day of her life than most of the people in this room would be on their best. Then he looked at Camille Beaumont, and he asked her the only question that mattered. He asked, every cup of coffee, every kind question, every minute you spent learning how I lost my wife. Would you have said a single word of it if you still thought I was just the man who fixes your car? Camille opened her mouth. Nothing came out that was both true and survivable. The silence was its own answer, and everyone in the room heard it. And then Elijah did something that surprised them all. He turned away from her because she was, he had decided, not worth one more second of his attention, and he knelt down in front of the stage where the Coronado sat gleaming, and he looked at the car he had saved, his own father's car, built by the company that was now his, and for a moment his careful face came apart. His mother came and stood beside him and put her worn hand on his shoulder, the same hand that had been struck, and the two of them looked at the beautiful, honest machine together, while 300 wealthy strangers stood in silence and learned something they should have known a long time ago. Later that night, a respected appraiser named Lionel Greaves, brought in to value the car for insurance, confirmed to the board what Elijah had refused to compromise. The Coronado was a true matching numbers original, its factory engine intact, and because of that, it was worth more than $2 million. Had anyone followed Camille Beaumont's suggestion and swapped in a modern engine for one flawless night, that value and that honesty would have been gone forever. The mechanic she had looked down on had not only been right, he had protected something priceless while she had tried to fake it. The fall of Camille Beaumont did not take long, and it was, from beginning to end, her own doing. Within 72 hours, the board of Crestline Automotive Group met in emergency session, and the new controlling owner of its parent company did not have to say a single word against her, because her own actions had said everything. She had paid for confidential information about the family that owned her company. She had used it to manufacture a false courtship. She had struck an innocent woman in front of 300 witnesses and a room full of press. She was removed as chief executive before the week was out, and the inquiry into how she had obtained the trust's private information moved, slowly and certainly, toward consequences far heavier than the loss of a job. And here is the part that tells you who Camille Beaumont truly was. At no point, not in the boardroom, not in the statements her lawyers released, not in the one brief conversation she demanded with Elijah and was granted, did she ever say the words, "I was wrong." She said the information should never have been so easy to obtain. She said the old woman should not have been near the car. She said the timeline had made everyone tense. She built, right to the very end, a wall of reasons, and behind every reason was the same refusal to look at the one true thing. She had decided that a man was worthless because he was poor, and she had been wrong, and she could not bear to say it out loud. Elijah Carter, for his part, did not enjoy her downfall the way the people around him expected. He had seen too much real loss to take pleasure in it. He simply stepped, with the same steadiness he brought to a damaged engine, into a life he had never asked for and had every right to refuse. He did not sell the shop. He kept it, and he kept working in it 2 days a week, because a man should never forget the smell of the work that made him. But he also walked into the glass tower downtown that carried his father's name, sat at the head of a long table, and surprised a great many people who had expected a mechanic to be overwhelmed. He was not overwhelmed. He had run a business on almost nothing. He had carried a family through grief. He had brought a dead engine back to life with 8 days and 2 hands. The room was bigger. The work was the same. The first thing he did with his new fortune, he did quietly, the way his mother had taught him to do good. He started a fund in Naomi's name that paid the full cost of trade school for young people who wanted to learn a craft and could not afford one. In its first year, it put 19 young men and women through programs in engine work, welding, and bodywork, and Elijah read every application himself. And he never once held a press conference about it. He bought his mother a house with no leak in the roof, in a quiet neighborhood with good light, and Pearl planted a garden, and on Sunday mornings he sat in her kitchen and drank coffee and finally heard, in pieces, the whole story of a young man with a brass medallion whom she had loved and lost and never named, not out of shame, but because some things a person keeps for herself until the right time arrives. A year after the night at the Marquette Hotel, Vance Continental held a small ceremony to mark the true history of the brand, and the restored Coronado, the real one, the honest one, was placed at the center of a new public collection of the company's classic cars, free for the whole city to come and see. Elijah stood before a few hundred people without notes and spoke about his father and about his mother and about the car. He said that the world will tell you, in 100 quiet ways, that you can measure the worth of a person by what they are wearing, by where they are seated, by the car they drive or do not drive. He said the world is wrong. He said the truest thing he knew about a person could not be seen in a ballroom or a boardroom, that it lived underneath all of that in how they treated someone who could do nothing for them in return. He looked out at the room. He said his mother had been exactly the same person in a navy dress. She pressed 3 times as she was in any room in the entire world, and that the only thing that had ever changed was whether the people around her were willing to see it. There was a woman at that ceremony named Simone Carver who had been hired to build the new collection, and who had first seen Elijah's work months earlier, on the night the Coronado was unveiled, and who had said to a colleague that whoever had brought that engine back to life understood something most people had forgotten, that there is a kind of honesty you can hear in a machine. She had not known then that he was anyone but a mechanic. That was perhaps the point. She found him after his speech, and she did not talk to him about money or about the Vance name. She talked to him about the car, about the slow, patient work of the body panels, about the build sheet tucked under the seat for 60 years. He found himself talking more than he had in a very long time. When he left a few minutes before 3, because there was still someone who counted on the sound of his truck in the driveway, she asked if she might see him again. And he said yes, and he was surprised by how much he meant it. And somewhere across the city, Camille Beaumont, who no longer had a title or a tower or a chair, read about that ceremony in the paper. She saw the photograph of the man she had slapped a mother in front of, standing now in the center of a room that admired him, beside a woman who had been drawn to him when he had nothing at all. She had been so certain her whole life that worth was a thing you could see. She sat with that photograph for a long time. Whether she ever truly understood what she had thrown away, no one can say. She never said the words. People like that rarely do. As for Elijah Carter, he drove home that afternoon the way he drove home every afternoon, with a folded drawing on the dashboard and a small pink hair tie looped twice around his wrist. He had a fortune now, and a name, and a father he had found too late to ever meet, and a mother he had loved his whole life long. But the thing he carried up the driveway, the thing that had pulled him home at the same hour through every hard year, had never once been any of that. He parked the truck. He sat for a moment in the quiet. Then he lifted the brass medallion from around his neck, the crossed keys, the single star, and he closed it gently in his hand, and he went inside to the someone who was waiting, because that, in the end, was the only fortune he had ever truly needed. If this story moved you, take 1 second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. And before you go, tell me in the comments, have you ever watched someone be judged for what they were wearing instead of who they really were? I read every single comment. Stay with me until the very end of the next story, because the moment everything turns is always worth the wait. This story is a work of fiction. All names, characters, companies, and events are products of the imagination and dramatized for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people or businesses is purely coincidental. I wrote this one because of something small I keep noticing in real life. We are quick, all of us, to size people up by the jacket, the car, the shoes. But the people who raised us, the ones who cleaned floors and pressed a navy dress 3 times so we could have a chance, almost never wear their worth where you can see it. The lesson I wanted to leave you with is simple. Be kind to the person who can do nothing for you. That is the only true test of who you are. Thank you for listening.